Content creators are monetizing the hatred that black men and black women have between each other. One of the biggest scams, one of the biggest hustles that we're seeing currently online, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, you name the social media platform, and there's a content creator that has monetized and grown their platform, grown their views off of trying to monetize dysfunction, the enmity, and the overall vitriol that's promoted online between black men and black women. This is episode 87. Let's talk about it. Rarely, if ever, do any of these arguments come from a non-Western point of view. What we do as people, we use Western civilization. Now, when I say this, when I say Western civilization, I'm classifying the particular paradigm of American culture. I'm talking about Western European culture. I'm talking about these different societies that would have arose over the past 500 to 600 years or so. And a lot of our talking points is based on that view of women. A lot of our talking points are based on that view of men. But when we get outside of this modality, this structure that we live in, this way of perpetuating civilization, right? Once we move out of that frame of mind, once we move out of that modality, we see that there have been a myriad of ways that humans have interacted with each other over millennia, but we always choose to stick to these talking points. We use the culture that we've been indoctrinated with, that we've been accustomed to. And once again, I don't believe in the binary of trying to look at something that's good or bad, but furthermore, I love to look at nuance, the intricacies, the complexities that we see in various cultures and societies around the world. But many of the talking points, they're rooted in a Christian, Judaic, Islamic way of looking at women and men. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong, but we also have to incorporate the way that other humans have lived and base talking points from there as well. But when you look at the manosphere, the red pill, you look at a lot of the Misandrists online that spew all of this hatred amongst men, more specifically, or at men, or more specifically black men. You look at all of these different groups and all of these people that are monetizing their platforms, growing their platforms. You have YouTubers and content creators that have 1 million plus views, and their entire platform is dedicated to exploiting the said enmity, the dysfunction between black men and black women. When you look at all of these platforms, they're all rooted in these hard, rigid, ossified talking points and definitions of men and women that we learn out of Western culture. Red pill and manosphere critiques of women, more specifically black women, are coming from a place of racism. When you see a lot of the arguments that are put out there by so-called misandrists, they're labeled as men, but more specifically black men. If you take a lot of these arguments and you go back to the early 2000s, you can find this stuff on a Stormfront forum, which was a racist website. So a lot of these arguments, they're rooted in self-hate, they're rooted in racism. And when you look at a lot of these platforms, they really offer no real solution. They're not trying to talk about how do we come together, how do we atone, how do we build towards a resolution to bring families together, to build and mend relationships. They have no answers about that. It's all about profiting off of the dysfunction between black men and black women. This online war, if you will, between black men and black women, a lot of the talking points, they're rooted in archaic values that were brought to us out of different cultures and groups throughout Western Europe, out of different Islamic cultures. It's a way of perceiving women in Western civilization as a byproduct of, the patriarchy, if you will, where we want to look at women as being infantile. A lot of the arguments that we use against women is that women aren't logical. They're not as logical or as rational as men. In a way, when you look at many biblical texts, when you look at many different religions, when you look at just the way that we've cultivated this view over the past, I would say 1,000 years. So if you're looking at the settlers that came to the Americas, if you're looking at the Spanish that would have came to the Caribbean, the Portuguese that would have came to South America, if you're looking at the different groups throughout Europe, whether you're talking about the Alemanni or the Germans, if you're talking about the people of the Iberian Peninsula, Catholics, different forms of Christianity such as the Cathars, one of the ubiquitous themes, and even if you go back to people like Plato and Aristotle himself even said that the maturity and the level of judgment and logic is nowhere near that of a man. This perspective that we've cultivated about women in our current paradigm is predicated and is rooted in over 1,000 years of hatred of women that came out of many of these cultures around the Mediterranean and Western Europe. And a lot of these talking points are rooted in the fact that there's always been this struggle to regulate the sexuality of women. And then when you see the advent of agriculture, this is something that I've spoken about a lot in the past. When you see the advent of agriculture, one of the things that becomes synonymous with that is that you're looking at women as your property. You're not just looking at them as another corporeal human being that has their own mental faculties, their own self-agency. You're looking at this person as being an extension of you. A lot of the etymology, when you look at the words that we have for women, or wife or wifeman, it comes from like an extension of being based upon the man. Like even in Genesis in Hebrew, there's a term where it says that Adam was actually called Ish, and then the woman was called Isha. So she was taken out of Adam. So one of the other crazy things is that in many of these Western religions, some of these religions that would have arose out of the Middle East, even a woman's existence is predicated on being taken out of. Women are illogical. Women need men to lead. Women cannot function without male leadership. This is an argument that many of these talking points are putting out there, whether it's from the red pill community, a manosphere community, or other communities, is to try to assault and attack the intelligence, the acumen of women. But when we get out of Western history, when we get out of Western Europe, or even, let me say this, if we go to pre-Christian, pre-Roman Western Europe, if you will, you can look at Viking groups where women were merchants. Women could freely divorce who they wanted to and marry who they wanted to freely, could potentially own land. You look at, for example, if you look at the Druids in the ancient Gaul, which is modern day France, you look at the Druids, they have women that were priestess, women that knew astronomy, women that studied different constellations and had a robust knowledge of this. This would have been brought to an end eventually by the Romans. When you go into many parts of West Africa, what makes West Africa unique is that it really was able to evolve outside of a paradigm or a narrative that evolved ancient Egypt or the Numidians or Carthage or Rome or Greece. It was able to kind of evolve outside of that. One of the funny things is that when you look at Walata, there was a traveler by the name of Ibn Battuta. He went into West Africa, and one of the things he noticed is that yes, there were a lot of Muslims, but the way they embraced Islam was radically different. He noted that, you know, the women, they didn't have that air or that degree of humility that he was accustomed to. He also noted that women did not mind walking around without a top on in the presence of men. These things he was taken back by, but it showed that there was a different way of operating and looking at life. And even if you want to go all the way back into antiquity, you can look at things like Nile Valley culture, Nile Valley civilization. One of the things you see is that one of the paramount deities of writing, of wisdom, of the cosmos, of astronomy, of history, one of the paramount deities, in addition to Thoth or Jehudi, is Seshet. Seshet is a goddess of wisdom. So as far back, we're talking about over thousands of years ago, women were revered for their perspective, for their acumen, for their leadership. And there was always a need to balance things with the principle, the duality of the feminine and the masculine principle. And when you get into different cultures outside of the Western paradigm that we're accustomed to, we start to see the juxtaposition of the masculine and the feminine principle. And it's ubiquitous throughout West Africa, throughout even in pre-Roman, pre-Christian cultures in Western Europe as well. So my thing is, if we're going to talk about things being natural to humans, we have to look at the full scope of humanity in its totality, because the way that we live in America, the way that people live in Western Europe, Canada, etc., there are other groups of people that have millennia of history, millennia of relationships, and how they relate to one another outside of how we live, that can throw a monkey wrench in the way that we want to look at men and women. And many of these people, whether it's black male content creators, black women content creators, white male content creators, whomever it is, they never seem to take into mind in their arguments, what about other cultures outside of the paradigm that we live in? What about hunter-gatherers? How would their perspective on the way men and women should relate throw a monkey wrench potentially in this rhetoric that we're spewing? The categorization of sex and morality was created, it was drafted, it was framed by racists that were coming to the Americas, that were seeing Mesoamerican culture, that were seeing West African cultures. This concept that when women walk around naked, that they're asked to be raped. When you look at these different cultures, whether it's in Mesoamerican culture, whether you're looking at the Aztecs, whether you're looking at the Maya, whether you're looking at the Powhatan Confederacy, whether you're looking at peoples throughout West Africa, there's no concept of rape in these cultures where, these primitive, savage women, according to these explorers, were wanting or inviting or causing the desires of these travelers to be insatiable, and they were inviting this sort of torture and trauma on themselves. So this framework, this narrative that indigenous women, African women, just were hypersexual and couldn't control themselves, is coming from a place where you're not looking at these people as your equal. You're not looking at these people as human beings. You're not recognizing their self-agency and the fact that your culture should not and is not the barometer for how other cultures should act and conduct themselves. And because you're coming here and you have this xenophobia against these different groups, you're allowing your own perspective, your worldview, to facilitate conditions where you can carry out the R word, and you can essay different people in these different groups that you are coming across. And this is a problem because now this frame of mind is how we're looking at each other now. When you look at different groups, like for example, I've mentioned this in other lectures, videos, etc. You have one group I love to look at is the Wodabi, the Fulani women, who have a festival after their rainy season every year where they actually are able to choose another husband, to choose someone that they feel is more attractive, more masculine. And the men, they dress themselves up, they paint themselves. It's a really unique festival. I always point this out because it shows that there's a diversity. There's a myriad of ways of living and relating to each other, as far as relationships, love, and coitus, if you will. We can't have this linear and this worldview and this paucity for how we're supposed to relate. And a lot of these content creators, you can tell clearly they never studied history. They never picked up anything about cultural anthropology. Their perspective, their lectures and their rhetoric that they put out there, if you will, is based upon this very linear, this very small way of looking and defining human beings. People's History of the United States. This is a book by historian Howard Zinn. One of the first parts of the first chapter, he talks about when Columbus and his men came in contact with the Arawak. And so a lot of the information that we have about this, this comes from works of travelers with them, people like Bartolome de las Casas. And one of the things that they mention about the Arawak women is that they chose sexual partners freely. There was no sexual jealousy among them, and it struck these men as weird or alien. Now, this is the way these people have been living for millennia, but these explorers were able to come out and say these women, they had insatiable sexual appetites. This gave them permission to rape and sexually exploit these women. And this is a frame of mind that we have now. So whenever we hear about a woman getting assaulted, the patriarchy, the hatred that we realize that we actually have of women in society. When we hear about women getting assaulted, we say things like, what was she wearing? As if what a woman wears warrants her to be attacked, warrants her to be assaulted. This is a perspective and a frame of mind that's based off of this Western structure, this framework of looking at any woman that operates outside of a modality that was dictated by a certain religion, that was dictated by a certain culture that you see around the Mediterranean, Western Europe. We still have this now. And it's the same way that these settlers and these colonizers and these people that went into these lands and brought pathogens that decimated entire populations, they had the same frame of mind that if I see an Arawak woman, if I see an Ashanti woman, if I see a woman that's walking around with her breast out, then this means that she's inviting me sexually. This means that she's less than human. Why does clothing make you more sophisticated or more civilized? This concept of civilization, it has facilitated conditions where we can accost people, we can commit genocide, we can do perverse things to other human beings because they don't fall in line with our view of civilization. And this is just crazy and it's perverse. And a lot of times these content creators, these men and women that talk about relationships, talk about the natural state of men and women, they spread this sort of rhetoric, they spread this sort of vitriol unknowingly because they're speaking about things, about topics, about the history of how relationships developed in the Western world without actually sitting down and doing any research. The children of Holocaust survivors have been shown to have alterations on their genetic expression. This is epigenetics, the idea that trauma can be inherited on a genetic level. There have been articles that spoke about how the children of Holocaust survivors experienced trauma and inherited the trauma of their ancestors on a genetic level. Dr. Joy DeGruy, she put out this work called the Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And in it, what she argues is that African Americans, the descendants of enslaved people in the United States, have inherited multi-generational trauma that is almost on a genetic level. So this field of epigenetics, this science, it presents a really compelling argument that trauma isn't this isolated event. Trauma isn't just something that impacts you only, but it can affect your generations that come from you, the progeny that come from you as well. Studies have shown that sometimes people that struggle with obesity, at one point in their family lineage, they had an ancestor that suffered from a famine. So we see that trauma can actually ripple out over generations on a genetic level. The point that I'm making with this, or even bringing this up, is that a lot of these arguments, these critiques that we have of black men, these critiques that we have of black women, they're coming from a place of trauma. They're coming from a place of slavery, if you will. A lot of these concepts, these frameworks, these templates we have for black manhood, black womanhood is a product of the enslavement of people here in the Americas. And we don't identify that. And it's dangerous when we're trying to heal and atone and find solutions for relationships where we're not discussing the source of a lot of the trauma that we're currently experiencing. The idea of hypersexuality amongst black women, the idea of promiscuity being innate to black women, this has its essence, its roots, its start in slavery. This comes from when people from France, the British Isles, went to Africa and they met black women who were not bashful about their nudity. They had a different cultural concept of sexuality. This idea, it provided a justification in their minds that these women have an insatiable sexual appetite. We would see on slave ships, you can read The Slave Ship by Marcus Rediker, the atrocities, the perversion that black women and men were subject to. Even in the domestic slave trade after 1808, when you're looking at what happened to black women here in the United States, many black women were subject to constant sexual abuse, constant sexual assault. Now, if we're looking at epigenetics, you have to look at the fact that this ripples out genetically. You have to look at the fact that this doesn't just start and end with one person. So we're looking at it from that perspective. A lot of these talking points, a lot of these arguments, they're rooted in a place from trauma. They're rooted in a place from sexual abuse and sexual assault. They're rooted in a place where certain perspectives and views were imposed on you by people that saw you as property, by a certain paradigm where you were just treated like cattle. This is where a lot of these talking points and these arguments are coming from. The perennial trauma that many black women were subject to. And because of this, there were certain articles that were done. Even scientifically, people tried to say during the antebellum period that black women were naturally promiscuous and that it was their fault that they were assaulted by the slave owners. It was their fault that they may have been subject to being victim of multiple rapes because they just had a sexual appetite that could not be satisfied. So when I see a lot of these content creators that get on their camera, their phone, whatever it is, and their whole argument is that black women have high body counts, black women are this, black women aren't able to be controlled, black women are masculine. These sound identical to talking points that if you went back to the 1700s, you would see it. If you went back to the 1800s, you would see it in certain journals trying to justify medically and scientifically why black women naturally should be treated in a hypersexual manner. Over 82 to 85% of black men are actually married to black women. Black fathers are shown to be in their children's lives more so than any other group of fathers. So a lot of times these ideas and these concepts that we're putting out there, it's not really backed statistically. It's not really backed by any sort of real data or research. But we put out these arguments and these half-truths without actually researching things. We put this out there about black women or black men, and we don't don't even really sit down to research the arguments that we're trying to articulate to people. But furthermore, my huge issue here is that I look at everything from a historical perspective. When I go back and I have to study pre-colonial societies, I see a symmetry. I see an equilibrium of the masculine and the feminine principle of black men and black women working together to create language, to create different perspectives on astrology, if you will. I see different pieces of literature, sciences, medicinal knowledge that come out of the ingenuity of black men and women working together, whether you're looking at the Khoisan people, whether you're looking at the Hosa, whether you're looking at the Yoruba, or what we would know as the Igbo. You see the genius and the brilliance of what happens when black women and men come together and pool intellectual resources. A lot of great and innovative things are able to happen. This war that's being exploited online is not really matriculating onto the real world. You know, when I go out, I still see happily married black couples dating. I don't see this in real life. But my problem is that a lot of impressionable people, a lot of young people are going to see these content creators, and they're going to spit and spew a lot of the toxic and racist rhetoric. And even though a person may be a black content creator, they can still spew a lot of racist rhetoric that's counterproductive. So a lot of impressionable young people are going to take many of these talking points and they're going to run with it. They're not going to provide any proper pushback on these content creators. It's sad that the enmity, and it's not preponderant, it's not that not 100% of black men and black women hate each other. It's not the case at all. But the fact that this enmity, if you will, is able to be monetized, the fact that people can build over a YouTube platform, 200, 300, 400, 500,000 followers, all based off of the vitriol that they want to exacerbate between black men and women. I've seen a black content creator, I can't remember her name, but she said something to the effect that black male babies should be aborted. I've seen content creators say that black men are bullet bags. I've seen black male content creators say things like black men should avoid black women totally. Black men need to go outside of the United States to find a wife. These are counterproductive arguments, and if you follow people like this, you should unfollow them. They provide no real resolution, and clearly by saying such idiotic things, they really haven't sat down to do the research on the different events and circumstances that produce the current paradigm that we live under. This has been episode 87. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'll be back with episode 88. Much love. Take care. Peace.